about vegetarianism?
What are your thoughts on vegetarianism?
I just think it's a pretty obvious thing to do, to be honest.
Elucidate.
Oh, that's horrible. That's just black hot milk. Wait, is that made of coffee? That's not chocolate. That might explain it.
Yeah.
That explains it. I thought it wasn't very coffee.
The vegetarianism, that.
Well, it's just the way to go, really. There's no point in not being vegetarian. Because it's just not being vegetarianism for vegetarian. Can you edit that out? Not being vegetarian.
Yeah, I'll edit this. Put you in a favourable light. It'll take quite a lot of work, but I'll manage it.
Alright, so yeah, not being vegetarian involves for most people, as Tolstoy said, suppressing a certain amount of humanity and critical thought, because you wouldn't actually thought you're basically eating this flesh for pleasure. I mean, I think it's dubious pleasure, but people find pleasure in it, fake pleasure in it. But you have to kind of ignore the suffering and the consequences of your actions, because if you didn't, then you really, unless you, the only reason why you would eat meat, the only sort of moral reason, the way you can justify it yourself, is if an animal's pain and suffering is worth absolutely nothing whatsoever. But most people who eat meat don't actually believe that, so they kind of exist in a twilight zone where they're denying that to themselves. Whereas that's quite sad. But it's more sad for the animal.
If you could give me a slightly less perfunctory response to the initial question, I think it would help a lot. It would help us.
So what was the initial question?
Vegetarianism, question mark.
So that was perfunctory, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was pretty workaday.
Oh, I see. Well, it just seems to me to be a really straightforward question, because there's no... One finds oneself groping, as it were, for reasons why not vegetarianism. I think that's a more interesting question. Because vegetarianism, it's just, tautological almost as a question. But not vegetarianism is an interesting question, and I think that's really where the perfunctorality might lie.
So, veganism.
Yeah, I mean, veganism vegetarianism is just is veganism adapted to the modern imperfect world.
That does make a lot of sense.
I think that veganism with a limited amount of non-veganism would be fine in a world where it was, because the problem is mass non-vegetarianism lends itself towards the kind of brutality of the meat industry.
So I guess
the two
dairy products and the eating of them isn't intrinsically wrong.
No, you've got the two issues. There's the question of whether it's morally wrong to eat the flesh of an animal at all. I mean, my answer would be that it is.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of the suffering of the animal, which is the one that most people address themselves to. And veganism is a way of addressing that question in particular. But veganism in this current imperfect world is a logical conclusion. But vegetarianism is much easier because the world is set up to be very anti-vegan. But a limited non-veganism would make sense, because there wouldn't need to be the intensiveness associated with all forms of animal-related products, eating, gnawing upon flesh and the sort of milk and the udder of, say, a cow, for example. So I think you have to separate out the general kind of moral questions from practical reality. I mean, personally, I would never gnaw upon any animal, and that's for that reason, I can distinguish between veganism and vegetarianism. But the distinction in today's society isn't really as strong because the conditions surrounding both activities are equally unsavoury. And even if death doesn't result directly from a vegetarian but non-vegan diet, it indirectly contributes towards death. And not only that, it contributes very directly towards suffering. And that's the problem. But I have no problem per se with consuming animal products. But I do have a problem, a fundamental red line when it comes to consuming the flesh of these poor, innocent creatures.
Would you eat insects? Insects out of pig necessity.
Insecticide is a dirty word.
No, but insects in general, would you eat insects like...
I think there's a difference between necessity and choice. When it comes to choice, absolutely not. In times of necessity, which I've never faced in my life, my answer might be different. But I think, for example, the first sort of reaction in the case of necessity would be to anaesthetize an animal with an excessive number of legs, and then eat the legs that were superfluous, and that way the animal wouldn't go to any pain, but you'd be able to, to sort of consume that to keep yourself going. Well, exactly. If you could, I think the hexapus is a perfectly viable proposition.
But what about the fact that they have, well, not exactly brains in their tentacles, but sort of extensions? Yeah.
Well, modern surgery would have to take over, and I think that's where human progress can complement the progress of animals' welfare, rather than detract from it.
Just to say that maybe 5, 6, 7 years into the future, when we can cultivate machines with edible and nutritionally viable flesh, what would your thoughts be there? That's machines with artificial intelligence, completely superfluous to their meat-eating.
So one can sit without diminishing from the artificial intelligence. Was that the scenario?
That may be the scenario.
Were that to be the scenario, then there's no problem with eating this flesh. But I think what you're looking at is actually, for example, the manufacture of corn, trademark, takes place in quite a similar way. It's sort of grown in a quasi-organic fashion. And I think that could be the way forward. But again, this is just a question of choice and of kind of pleasure. But the essentials for life are provided by the humble bee and his acolytes.
And the inefficiency of the meat trade as well. Do you have any concern around that?
This is again...
I know that that's rendered superfluous to your argument.
There's a practical and a moral.
Yeah.
And as it happens, they complement each other quite nicely.
Yeah.
So it's selfish both on moral, in the great oneness, we're causing damage, and for humanity in the limited context, we're causing damage as well. And that's a sort of moral and a practical. And we're debasing ourselves as well. Except me.
In conclusion?
In conclusion, vegetarianism.
Thank you.